Firstly, I'd like to introduce my valued guests, Professor David Rooney from Macquarie Uni Business School, who's been investigating the nature of wisdom and how to develop it for about 20 years now. And David is influenced by Aristotle's virtue ethics and a Buddhist perspective. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And Dr. Elizabeth King from the Nantian Institute. And Elizabeth has an extensive corporate history and has studied wise decision-making and has also completed a PhD on leadership in uncertainty and the role of wisdom-based mindfulness as a solution. Welcome, Elizabeth. And Dr. Justin Brienza, a senior lecturer and organisational psychologist at the University of Queensland Business School. Justin started in cognitive science and artificial intelligence, and following finding a gap in there being little scientific work on wisdom in organisations and management, Justin has made an assessment of wise reasoning and the biases that interfere with wisdom in leadership. So welcome, Justin.
Thank you.
So I'd like to begin today by tackling the big question. And I noticed, David, you've got a light above your head. We want that to turn on with the answers.
Yeah. Well, if I ever get a question 100% right, that little light switches on. So
okay,
need to watch that.
So let's start with the first question. How would you define wisdom?
Okay, so this is the big question. Yeah, there's no question about that. And this is my definition today. and I think I'm going to just put the caveat on that I don't think we have reached full agreement about exactly how to define wisdom, and maybe the nature of the beast is that we never will. But so this is how I'm thinking about it at the moment. So I see wisdom as a practice. It's something that people do. And so it's the embodiment of, let's say, wise virtues or wise abilities, wise capacities. And it's built on an overarching concern to be excellent in practical action in life. So wisdom is something that people do as they go about their life. And it's not just about knowing what's right and wrong. It's also the ability to apply knowledge to specific situations. So that kind of says that wisdom is a situated ability, and what it actually looks like is kind of defined by the situation, which is one of the reasons why I think we have so much trouble defining it. It also involves the application of good judgment and ethical character. So a person has to be ethical. You need to be a virtuous person or person of good character. And both that part of the definition and the one before also reaches into the work that Justin does about wise reasoning or ethical reasoning. And wisdom is acquired through experience and learning. So it's not just about book learning. The person has to engage with the world. So the kind of religious concept of, or the Christian concept of wisdom of a wise kind of person living in a cave having wise thoughts is kind of out of sync with the way I see wisdom. And one then has to be able to integrate all of these or harmonize, and I prefer harmony rather than integration, all of these things so that they embody the knowledge that they have and the experience they have that tells them how to act in particular situations to get excellent outcomes, and in particular very difficult and challenging situations. So that's a bit of an unwieldy definition, but that's the one I'm going with at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And Justin, would you like to add anything to that from your position, your perspective?
Sure. I would agree with David that is very complex, and I guess to sum up, like he said, the reason it is complex is because it's depending on context. what's wise in one situation might not be wise in another situation. So I like to start with my students by giving them the simplest definition that I can, by saying, how can you be both moral and ethical and also rational and intelligent at the same time in the decisions that you're making? And they say, oh, that's easy. I'm doing that right now. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm coming to class and so on, right? But that's the problem. It's when we have challenges in life that becomes difficult, and to knowing how to implement that in certain specific situations becomes difficult.
And so let's move it then to the certain situation of leadership. And I'll come to you, Elizabeth, in a wise leader. So what I'm hearing is leadership is very much wisdom is very much an inaction thing. So Elizabeth, how would that be inaction in leadership?
Yeah, great. So the inaction of wise leadership is essentially taking the elements that David and Justin have just talked about of wisdom and putting them into context. So that means a wise leader is combining their intellectual knowledge, their technical skill, and a deep mindful understanding of the intricate interplay between human behaviour and social dynamics, right? So what this enables them to do is make decisions that reflect not just the present moment, but also the long-term sustainability and ethical implications of their decision. Because if we build on Monica Ardelt's work, who unpacks beautifully the elements of wisdom, we can see then that the characterization of a wise leader with empathy and patience, resilience, humility, and these good decisions come from these elements that Monica Ardelt tells us play out at the level of the individual, the team, and an organization. And that is the clear seeing of a cognitive wisdom, the reflective aspect of wisdom, which you can imagine is like an internal compass to the mind, and the compassionate aspect, which builds a bridge between the leader and the rest of the organization. So my answer to that is, it is the combination of intellectual knowledge, technical skill, and deep understanding.
Okay, and so when we take all of those concepts into an organisation that is in deep trouble, experiencing huge challenges, or maybe in crisis, David, I'll come to you for this. How are those qualities used in that crisis situation? Do they hold up? Are they aspirational? Are they good intentions? How do they actually get actioned in a crisis situation?
Well, very often they don't get actioned very well at all, as we've seen through the COVID pandemic. But they can be. And I think if individuals and particularly leaders have undergone the right kind of preparation, then they can put themselves in a position where they're very likely to act in, or very much more likely to act in wise ways in difficult situations. And I guess one area or one aspect of wisdom that Aristotle and Plato would totally agree with some of the classic texts, Buddhist texts, would be that good character, so wise character, is largely built out of the development of really sound habits. So wise habits of mind, but also habits of body. So habitualized wise behavior, and that's something that we don't really emphasize in leadership training, or haven't done much of. I mean, I try to do it in the leadership development and leadership teaching that I do. But one thing we know for sure is that leadership development training globally doesn't work very well. We see that every day. And I think one of the reasons, and perhaps maybe the main reason, is that it's not actually focused on developing theoretical knowledge and conceptual knowledge, but not on actual behavior. And so it's just like, we see in professional sports, they've taken to mindfulness, which they call mental skills training. And what they're trying to do over and over again is develop these habits of mind and body that football players or basketball players or whoever it is can reliably repeat under extremes of pressure. And we don't see the same sort of developmental work happening in leadership and management and general professional development, whether it's in medicine or law or nursing or social work or whatever. So I do believe, I'm optimistic that we can make serious inroads into wise behaviour in leaders and other people. And I think it was Plato said in the Republic that no one is really fit for leadership until they've had about 50 years of education and training. So we don't have to stick to that, the dictator of 50 years, but he's basically saying, look, the development process is important. And if you want to be a leader, you have to commit to that over the long time. And as I pointed out in the first of my elements of wisdom, is that it's deep and ongoing concern to be excellent, and on behalf of the individual, but also on behalf of the people who are helping to develop those individuals. So I think it can be done, and we just have to get better at putting our minds to what it is we need to do to get that done, and having an education system that's ever more pushed in the direction of employment skills training rather than genuine education is not helping us in that task.
Can I ask you, if we have an individual who has good habits, wise habits, and can, as an individual, sustain that wisdom, what's necessary in the organisation around them when crisis hits to really allow those qualities to be part of the solution or to actually operate? So you might have one or two individuals who are deeply wise, but they're stuck in an organisational structure that isn't, perhaps.
Yeah.
What about the organisation that surrounds? Are there any wise qualities of an organisation that should be developed to frame the individual qualities and characteristics?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. I mean, I just happened to be looking at the news this morning where there was a report saying that Australian workplaces are way more toxic and unhealthy than even American workplaces. And there's your starting point. Let's get the environment right, and part of that is we have to get better at choosing the people we put in charge. We've got to get better at choosing leaders. What I see in Australia is that we don't put leaders in leadership positions. We put people who I call super followers in leadership positions because they make us feel comfortable. They're just mirrors of ourselves that we like and feel comfortable with. But that doesn't guarantee any outcome when they're under pressure, when they're facing really novel and really difficult situations. Being a super follower does not help you for that. Being a super follower helps you to deal with normalcy really well. So that's a start. And I think more generally, we've got to look at organisational culture. What are the cultures in our workplace? What is it that we truly value? Is it maximising profit, or is there a larger role that workplaces play in society? And given the amount of time that we spend doing employed work, it has a big influence on all of us. And I think one of the things that Justin can probably talk about better than I can is that why is it that perfectly decent people turn up to work and park their values in the parking lot and don't bring them into the workplace? Why do they do, on behalf of their organisations, horrible things that are actually against their own belief systems, their own value systems? So there's a huge amount we can do, and there's a lot that's actually not that hard to do. We know a lot about what makes excellent leaders. It just hasn't leaked through into the corporate or political world. And if we, we've got to get over, and Justin can talk more about biases. There are all sorts of biases that come into play in how we select leaders, and they're not helping us. We're selecting the wrong people.
So Justin, over to you to answer the challenge.
Yikes. Okay.
Sorry, Justin.
It's okay. I think part of the problem is that it's not that leaders are good or bad. It's that part of it is that they become over reliant on a certain heuristic or way of leading that works for them in general when it's the status quo, when this is what helped them to rise to the top, and then they become over reliant on it. But the problem with wisdom is that when we need it is exactly when something is changing or ought to change. So people are coming to work, they've learned this system of things, they've learned all the bureaucracies, they've learned all of how that culture works, and it's the devil they know. They become comfortable with it, and anything aside from that is like, oh yeah, we should all, we hope things can change here, and we hope things that we can improve things. Like, how can we do better? But what that requires is for people to get out of their comfort zone. A leader can't be a wise leader if they can't adapt to the situation. So what David was saying about, can we practice it like we practice sports? That is exactly what we need to do. The problem is that with sports, the field is always the same. With organizations, when wisdom is needed, it's because the field has changed, or like in COVID, or it needs to change, and there's going to be resistance because the people at the top are not going to want to change, and they're not going to appreciate leaders who are trying to make a change, whether they say so or whether they know so or not. That's the bias. They implicitly want things to stay the same because it's what they know. It's not threatening their livelihood, their status, and so on. And so
even in the presence of a wise decision being made by somebody, what you're saying is that people will not see that decision. They'll make they'll block change or refuse to go with it based on other things when there's clearly a wise decision in the room or a wise person in the room.
That's sort of when motivated reasoning comes in. You can know something's good and you still might want to fight against it. Look, people are going to work, their well-being is not very high, or they're stressed out, or there's conflicts at work already, and you're going to ask them to change something. Well, I'm busy enough, right? So why are you putting more on my plate? You want me to, I just learned how to do X, Y, and Z, and now you're telling me to do A, B, and C. So this is the part of that energy that it takes to try to implement wisdom at even just a personal level or organizational level. Can people, what I think is that why wouldn't everybody want to be wise? It's those constraints. It's people are tired. There's a lot of rules and status quo in the organization, and it just makes it like that's an intractable impasse.
So I'm just going right out in left field now. What I'm hearing is that we don't have or value the embodied experience of wisdom. We're operating in a cognitive space. If we all practiced and knew what the feeling of wisdom is in the body, or good decisions are in the body, and how they actually can settle us down, do you think there's something completely missing there in the embodied wisdom? I'll just let anybody comment on that and say you're mad, doesn't exist.
Oh no, I think it's been shown in some of the appalling examples of bad governance over the last few years in Australia, that the failure of wise decision making is a failure of emotional intelligence and empathy and a development of those types of skills. But that without blame, we can say that our society and our corporate cultures currently actually reward the sorts of things David's been talking about, and they reward intellectual skills. We currently don't have a measurement and therefore a way to guide the development of a culture in an organisation that fosters trust, open dialogue and shared responsibility, which is where we create. So wise decisions come from a culture that enables us to make them. So it's very difficult for the individual you discuss to be pervasively impacting an organisation if they don't have a culture. So what we have is these toxic cultures David's referred to, and we need to create a different type of culture, one that fosters wisdom in an embodied way, as you say.
Yeah, and I think we it's that mind-body duality problem, and we do tend to separate the things of the mind and things of the body into two different separate envelopes, and I think we've got to get better at seeing mind and body as just two sides of the same coin, and you can't bodily perform wisely without there have been the mental development, the psychological development as well. So they've got to happen in tandem, and this is where those professional sports teams get it right. They understand that the two things are actually one thing, and you've got to do them both and do them at the same time. And like our universities are completely set up to just be focused on things of the mind, and I think that's something we need to change.
Is there a language of embodied wisdom? Is there a language that applies to that, feeling tones and?
There is, but the language doesn't have any currency at the moment in places like business schools or law schools or medical schools or wherever, or in executive suites in the corporate world. That language is not there, and I do think language is an important part of it because it gives you the tools to talk about it, to communicate, and I think communication is a huge part of actually doing wisdom in the real world, because you have to, if you're facing a difficult, novel situation and you've come up with a novel and challenging way forward, which is not going to be comfortable for people, you've got to be a damn good communicator as a leader to get them on board with you. And in that sense, communication is also about the extent to which people trust you, to whether they think you have their best interests at heart, and therefore it links back to the whole issue of compassion and kindness and empathy and so on. So and I don't think even amongst those of us who are working in the kind of wisdom study space, it's something we actually haven't really placed any effort on yet, is to talk about the language, how we should really talk about it when we're not talking to each other in highbrow theoretical ways. So yeah, it's a good question.
And so just to conclude, do we have any examples of wise leadership in action that we could share, just to give a demonstration of what it can look like, what it should look like or does look like?
Yeah, well, my favourite example is Mahatma Gandhi. And I guess, look, the reason why he's my favourite is because a truly wise person manages to get wise things done despite the real world. And so you look at Gandhi, and he came up with his non-violent civil disobedience approach to confronting the most terrifying power on the planet at the time, which was the British Empire. And he was a brilliant communicator. Early on in his professional career as a lawyer and a journalist, I think he was actually a pretty ordinary communicator, but he became a really fabulous public communicator. And a lot of his communication was bodily communication. So if we go back to the Salt March, for example, all you had to do was see the people marching. He didn't need to say a word. You just had to see it, and it communicated everything that he needed. But he also lived a very non-materialistic lifestyle. It's said that when he died, he only had 6 possessions. 6, you know, and his was a constant pursuit and a constant concern for excellence and peace and I guess compassion goes with that. But he also, so he was a great practitioner of wisdom, but he had a very deep knowledge of, let's call it philosophico-spiritual literature. And he understood that really pluralistic spiritual and philosophical tradition, Vedic tradition that is India and those Himalayan countries, and as well as Sri Lanka. So he really knew that stuff, and he had that ethos within him, as well as these practical ways of actually communicating and motivating people. And so he had a very deep personal and genuine commitment to kind of religious and cultural pluralism, which meant that he could empathize with a lot of people in India, not just the Hindu majority. And you know, just to go back to where I started, and he was still able to do this despite having no real resources to do it, and despite facing the greatest obstacles, you know, the entire might of the British Army and Air Force and Navy and government and civil service and all of that sort of stuff, all stood in his way. The real world was there. And, you know, I know MBA students have told me countless times, oh, well, what you're saying is fine, but you can't do that in the real world. Well, my answer to that is Gandhi did. So you can do it too. And he was just a normal guy with a degree from a university who really cared, and he figured out how to do it. So you can too. And we all can.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And just as a final conclusion, Elizabeth and Justin, do you have any examples come to mind of recent or contemporary wise leadership?
So I would like to put one forward, and that is first responders. I feel that there is a pervasive level of wisdom that comes through first responders' actions, whether it's the medical first responders, whether it's the police going to their daily domestic crisis. When I work with people in emergency, nurses and police, I see people easily making decisions for the greater good. I see people dealing with complexity in crisis and working on that frame of greater good continuously. And it reminds me that the difference between a wise and foolish decision is often the aspiration and the wish.
Thank you. I think that we've come to the end. I want to thank you so much for your time today and for contributing your wisdom to the topic of wisdom. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Although, Sue, my light still didn't turn on.
More work to be done.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.